Well, for more now on the implications of the U.S. decision, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Alexander Nekrassov. He served as an advisor to the Kremlin and was an investigative journalist with the Russian news agency TASS. From Florida, Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Here in the studio is Ian Williams. He's a fellow with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution in Beijing. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ian, let's start in the studio. This treaty, known as the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, is it now on life support?
Most certainly, yeah. Right now there is no treaty, no party to the treaty that is still remaining in compliance with the treaty. So right now it is a piece of paper. There is 6 months to possibly infuse some life back into that piece of paper, but as of now, it's pretty much a dead treaty. Right,
Ian, you say 6 months. What would it take to save the treaty?
Well, I think it would require, to be honest, a change in leadership in Moscow. I think Vladimir Putin has been trying to get out of this treaty for a very long time. I think he sees it as very much against Russian interests to be in it. And so I think that this is, in some ways, a good thing for Vladimir Putin, that the U.S. is withdrawing. Nevertheless, I do think it's a good decision for the U.S. to withdraw. When you have a two-way treaty that only one party is abiding by, that's not a treaty. So I think the action of the United States today is really just formalizing reality.
Well, we heard from the United States Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in that report from Nathan King. Alexander, let's go to Russia, and this is how the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, responded to these latest developments.
Consider the difference. They incriminate us with a violation which was a supposed launch of the 9M729 cruise missile off the allowed range. And next, they draw a conclusion. Russia does not want to acknowledge it. That means that we will suspend the treaty, and then we will pull out of it. If we use the same logic, we would say the same thing. The Americans do not want to acknowledge their violations in this respect. Let us also quit.
So, Alexander, firstly, the Russians are saying they did not violate the treaty. So how will Russia respond to what's going on right now?
Well, I think that there's going to be a lot of diplomatic accusations flying around. And I think personally that the situation in Europe and in the world has changed so dramatically in the past years, with NATO moving to Russian borders and other factors, that this treaty is not really good for both sides anymore, because the Americans obviously want to involve China into this situation, and I think it's pressure coming from Washington on China in this respect. When they say that Russia was sort of breaking some of the crucial points of this treaty, I think the Americans were doing roughly similar things, which were close sort of to the borderline, and that doesn't stick at all. But for the Russians, I agree with the point made that President Putin and the Russian generals might not be very happy with this treaty, because simply they have a new threat on their border now in Europe, and the situation has changed completely. So this treaty probably needs to be reviewed. It's probably not a good idea to completely forget about it and just simply say, oh, well, it's outdated now and let's, just simply ignore it. This is not a good idea, because we've seen it already with the anti-ballistic missile treaty, when the Americans simply walked away from it without really having any good reason for it. What did it do? It created a much more dangerous situation in the world. So we are at this point where everybody has to step back and really think what they are doing, because one of the most important points of that treaty is that unintended war, nuclear conflicts was one of the most important crucial bits. Soviet Union had to dismantle many more missiles than America. It was a compromise in that sense. But the Russian military command at that time thought that maybe this is worthwhile, because nobody wants an unintended nuclear war starting. But now, as I said, the situation has completely changed. We must look at everything from a different point of view.
Right. Aurel Braun, we are hearing that both sides think it might not be a bad idea to scrap this treaty, that it's perhaps outdated right now, but nuclear weapons are of concern to the entire world. Any possible exchange, even if it's just between the United States and Russia, would of course impact the rest of the world. How precarious a situation could we get ourselves into?
It is volatile. These weapons were destabilizing. This is the reason why there was this agreement through the INF. If the Russian government and the Russian generals think that this is a bad treaty for Russia, they're sadly mistaken. This was a very good treaty for Russia. An arms race is dangerous for everyone, but Russia can ill afford any kind of arms race. They can ill afford that kind of volatility. They were very brazen about this. There are very few experts one can think of who do not feel that Russia was violating this treaty. And in many ways, even though the Europeans are nervous about abandoning this treaty, they are united in believing that Russia is in violation and something has to be done. So I think Russia has overreacted. I think Russia has pushed the envelope, and in a way in which ultimately does not benefit Russia. It doesn't benefit anyone else either, but I think at the end of the day, the Russians are making a mistake if they think this was a good thing to so brazenly violate the INF Treaty.
All right, let me bring in Qinduo Xu. He's in Beijing. And Qinduo, what does China make of these exchanges that are going on between Russia and the United States right now? It could set off a nuclear arms race. What is Beijing's view?
Well, on the first of all, it is the treaty is critical to the say peace and stability or military power balance in the European continent. Remember, this treaty is it's a bilateral treaty between Russia and the United States. Of course, it also has its implications over the world. You would question the wisdom, of course, of the U.S. decision too here, because without the treaty, so what's to replace? There's no answer. And also, this is in the pattern for the U.S. government, to walk away from Paris Agreement, to walk away from Iran deal, from UNESCO and other, treaties and organizations. The problem, if you are a responsible big power, what should be done? If you look at accusations and counter-accusations between Moscow and Washington, I guess, technically, at least we should strengthen, say, the inspection and the verification arrangement to make sure that both sides are following the treaty closely. That would be probably a better choice. Now, without the treaty, say, U.S. walked away from the treaty, we are entering a stage of, I would say, a very fearful stage of unrestricted development of mid-range nuclear weapons, and then there's no whatever restrictions on that.
Ian, as we just heard in our report, there are accusations from the Russian side that the United States is also in violation of the INF Treaty with its Aegis Ashore weapon system, which have been deployed in Romania and will also be operational in Poland in 2020. Is the U.S. violating the treaty?
I do not believe so, no. Those launchers are not configured in their size and in software to be able to fire offensive cruise missiles. They're only capable of firing standard missile 3s, which are defensive weapons only. They may look similar on the outside, but on the inside, the canister holding the missile is different. And certainly the software, the fire control software that they use are different. So they do comport with the treaty.
Getting back to the point that Alexander Nekrassov made, that Europe has changed. I mean, this was a treaty that was signed during the time of the Cold War. You had the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO expands eastwards. How does that all bear on Russian thinking, do you think?
Well, I think I think one word that I've been hearing a lot that I think is different from 1987 to now is the word nuclear. If you look at the missiles, the kinds of weapons that we're seeing Russia deploying, if you look at the kinds of intermediate range missiles that the United States might deploy, these are not nuclear weapons. So I think with when this treaty goes away, or if this treaty goes away, we won't see, I don't think, a new nuclear arms race. What we will see is more of a technological competition, but with conventional precision-guided weapons. So it is a different dynamic than it was in 1987. I think that's an important distinction to make.
Alexander, looking at the European response to what the Americans have announced, NATO says that if Russia does not destroy the entire missile system arsenal, which allegedly violates this treaty, the INF Treaty, then it will bear sole responsibility for the end of the agreement. That is, Russia will bear responsibility.
Well, that's the usual method, basically, because nobody expects anything less than that. The Allies initially were not very happy at all with this decision by the Americans, and they were voicing their concerns openly, especially the Germans. And nobody wants really to return to that time when there were nukes all over Europe, facing the Soviet Union and vice versa. But I think that NATO would always come with this position. What is unexpected about NATO's position? Nothing. But the problem is that I think that what we are witnessing in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years, and especially with this administration, is that there is, I don't see any fear of a nuclear war on the part of the Americans, of the American government. In the past, during the Cold War, I remember very well when both sides were absolutely terrified of a potential conflict. Everybody was talking about the mutual destruction. Nobody could even, foresee a situation when even tactical nuclear weapons could be used. Nowadays, completely different language. Everybody is very sort of fancy-free. They're talking about, so what? We can use nuclear weapons if something happens. No big deal. You get this strange feeling that people in Washington and maybe in other Western capitals have some new nuclear bunkers somewhere made for them, and they think they can rush to them and survive a nuclear conflict. That's the difference that I see in this past 10, maybe even more years, a change of attitude. And maybe it has to do with generations who have come in, who don't remember any wars at all, even the Vietnam War. They don't really understand what it means to be involved in a serious conflict. In Russia, the former Soviet Union, Russia, people still remember the horrendous effects of a big war, and we still remember how many people have been killed. Nothing like that I see in the West and in America. And that, I think, is the biggest danger.
Right.
This shift in this psychology, this attitude towards nuclear conflict.
Okay. Aurel Braun, what is the European position on the INF? Some European leaders have said that they want the treaty to remain, they want to retain the treaty, but what is the European position? Because we remember initially when that INF treaty was signed, it meant the removal of weapons from Europe. Could we see a time when those weapons are redeployed?
Well, they are being redeployed in the case of Russia. And there is no doubt, even among the Europeans, about the Russian violations. And it is not new to the Trump administration. The Obama administration voiced very strong objections to what Russia was doing. The construction and development of these missiles, the testing of hypersonic cruise missiles. And so even those Europeans, like the Germans, who would like to see the treaty preserved in some form, it isn't a matter of preserving it at all costs. Things have changed since 1987, and one of the big changes is that Russia is not a superpower. It is not the Soviet Union. It is fantasizing if it believes it can play the same role as the Soviet Union has. It is overplaying its hand in a dangerous kind of fashion, and it is not that the West does not appreciate the dangers of nuclear war. It is not that you have just some kind of cowboy mentality. There is a deep and wide consensus that there has been this brazen violation, that this has to be dealt with. There are 6 months left. Russia can compromise. Russia can come to the negotiating table. So it doesn't have to be the case that this treaty is abandoned entirely, but certainly it is moving in that direction. Russia has agency. Russia is not merely a victim.
Yeah.
Russia has acted in Ukraine. Russia has acted in many parts of the world, and it bears responsibility.
Qinduo, The Carnegie Endowment, which is a United States think tank, they published a paper on this issue, and I'll read you just a paragraph from that paper, and I think this paragraph is very relevant because I think it encapsulates more than the dispute between Russia and the United States. And it says, U.S. officials say that the major reason for withdrawing is to contest China's growing military power and assertiveness. They argue that the United States needs to deploy conventional ground-based intermediate-range missile systems against China, systems that the INF Treaty prohibits the United States from fielding. And because Beijing is not a party to the treaty, officials argue the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, the Chinese army that is, has a tremendous advantage. Is that what this is all about?
Well, that's that's one of the arguments for the U.S. to withdraw from the treaty. But look, I mean, basically, if that's true thinking of Washington, basically, it is doing this at the expense of its European allies, for the so-called Asian allies in East Asia and the Pacific region. You would question how wise that move is. And secondly, if you look at, yes, the Chinese mid-range missiles development, the U.S. has the sea-based and air-based missiles that's much superior to the Chinese side, to the Russian side. The INF Treaty actually, in terms of that, the U.S. enjoys a strong advantage over the Russians because it does not restrict the development of the sea-based and air-based nuclear weapons over there, and the Russians are in disadvantage in this situation. So I mean, both sides, even Russia and the United States, without the restriction, there could be a deployment of this mid-range nuclear weapons in the European theater, and the European countries will become the victim. They will suffer the most, not the U.S. And of course, worldwide, as long as there is no limit. My American colleague mentioned about this is people will deploy more conventional instead of the nuclear weapons. But then without this limit, there's a dangerous. It's a dangerous time because you never know what your rivals are doing, deploying what kind of weapons. With the precision development, if you can target your enemy precisely, increasing precisely, and then there's no time to basically to make sure the suspected weapons, whether that's true or false. So in retaliation, there could be a lot of miscalculation. So that would be disastrous.
Ian, Qinduo raises a good point there, and that is, does the INF really constrain United States capabilities? Because if it has weapons that are based on ships or on submarines or even air-based, these things are moving all the time. They're not constrained by any kind of distance or limits on where they can go.
True, but these platforms are very expensive and they tend to be very slow. Only a small fraction of U.S. forces can be in any one place at any given time. So that gives kind of the home team, as it were, an advantage. So like Russia has a short-term firepower advantage in Eastern Europe. China has a short-term firepower advantage in the South China Sea. The United States has to move ships and troops and forces to that region in order to overcome those local advantages and rebalance things. So having more land-based strike assets in the region, closer to where these potential conflicts could occur, do tend to provide a stronger deterrent to a country that's looking to perhaps exact a very quick strike, a fait accompli, and ultimately enhance its deterrence against that kind of low-hanging sort of fruit, as it were.
Right. Alexander, the United States says if this is not fixed or something's not been done within the next 6 months, then that INF treaty could be dead. Moscow says it will retaliate if that happens. If this treaty is abandoned, Moscow will act as well. What options does Moscow have?
Well, basically, first of all, we need to remember something. The difference in the military budget between America and Russia is huge, enormous. And this is why Russia basically already has some sort of a initiative to come up with new, more sophisticated, more precise systems that can at least compensate the difference and the Russian disadvantages. Because, the Americans are openly saying we're going to increase our nuclear forces by so many times. They've openly been talking about this. And I can tell you another thing. The Russians were prepared for that sort of development, because when the NATO troops moved to the Russian borders, it was crucial for Russia to have short-distance nuclear missiles ready in any case. And they knew that at some point the Americans would claim that these short missiles under 500 kilometers are actually breaking the INF Treaty, and that's why they're going to pull out of it. That was expected by the military in Russia. But they have no choice. They have to have this defense shield, and they will continue to develop it. And it wasn't actually going against the INF Treaty, but as I said, they were expecting the Americans to come up with this, and then they did. So the retaliation will be technological. The Russians have already shown off some of their new technologies, and that is how they can retaliate. They can threaten American bases across the world, because American bases are much nearer to the Russian territory, and they can threaten American allies.
Right.
That's the only way they can retaliate.
Okay. Aurel Braun, some of the options being looked at as far as the Europeans are concerned, I mean, one of the options, this is from Brookings, the Brookings Institution here, is that the Europeans engage directly with the Russians, probably another meeting between Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin. The other is to use the military option. Brookings points out that the reason Russia initially signed that agreement was because of United States weapons that were deployed in Europe. What do you make of those options?
Certainly the Europeans might try to negotiate, but it's not going to be easy for Russia to split the alliance. You will see the kind of unity that is coming from the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who's holding Russia responsible. And Mike Pompeo said very clearly that there's strong support from the allies. So we should not mistake a willingness to have some negotiations which would eliminate these Russian weapons with an acceptance of Russia keeping these kind of volatile, destabilizing weapons.
Right.
In the long term, Russia is not doing a favor for itself.
Yeah.
And given what was said about the relationship between the United States and China, ironically, Russia is not doing any favors for China either.
Right.
By trying to be clever tactically and in the long term strategically putting itself at a greater risk through enhanced volatility.
Qinduo, very quickly, and I've only got 20 seconds for this, is the answer possibly a bigger agreement involving China, the United States, and Russia? Will China be open to something like that?
Well, I think the whole world is entering a new stage. Probably big powers, including the three powers,
right,
probably should come down to talk about the global stability in terms of arms control. Yes.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.